Cool. Hi everyone. So I'm Samuel, I'm a third year PhD student. This will be my first time giving a lecture of this kind and this length. So, you know, no rotten tomatoes please, but sympathy for me should not prevent you from engaging robustly with this. The material I'm going to present to you today is somewhat controversial in literary studies, so please don't feel afraid to question, challenge, ask questions. We should have time for questions at the end if I'm only going to speak for 35 minutes or so. There should be plenty of time. Alright, so I'm going to talk about evolutionary approaches to literary study, which may sound odd. I don't know, despite the fact that we're at the university where Charles Darwin himself studied, where Rosalind Franklin Watson and Crick deduced the structure of DNA. I am, as far as I know, the sort of most senior member of the English faculty who's doing this sort of research, which strikes me as kind of odd. A very old idea about literature is that literature is about human nature. And that part of the work that literature does for us is to give us insights and help us to navigate the human condition. Now, if you've come from outside the literature department, that idea probably does not seem particularly controversial to you. But what's happened within literary studies in the past 50 years is that the idea of human nature has been treated almost exclusively with suspicion. If it's not been explicitly rejected, it will have been subjected to indefinite forms of deconstruction and critique, which in any case, in practical terms, amounts to the same thing as an outright rejection of it. In any case, no concept of human nature has been able to stand seriously as a basis for any sort of literary theorizing. There are two potential responses, I guess, to if you believe that the concept of human nature is important to the study of literature. We can attempt to go back to a sort of naive or intuitive, or what psychologists would call folk psychological understanding of human nature, which is how most of us navigate the concept of human nature most of the time. The scholar I'm going to introduce to you today is named Joseph Carroll. He's a professor at the University of Missouri St. Louis, who in 1995 published Evolution and Literary Theory, which is arguably the founding text of literary Darwinism. His feeling was that he could not continue to take questions about Foucault at conferences. He gives without having something serious to respond with. He describes an incident at a conference where he was delivering, he had so far avoided the issue of post-structuralist theory up until that point and done ordinary historicist or interpretive work. And he was delivering a paper on Matthew Arnold when somebody else stood up and said, aha, but Professor Carroll has not considered the way that Foucault has problematized the notion of the individual subject. And Carroll writes, actually I had considered it in my head and dismissed it. But it became clear to me at that point that a sort of tacit dismissal or withdrawal from this debate was not going to be sufficient in the face of this kind of theory. So he drew on the then burgeoning field of evolutionary psychology, which has matured substantially since then, and tried to devise an approach to literary study that had a grounding in science and science of the mind. Evolutionary psychology remains, how do I put this? These theorists excite me, but they are the pariahs of the discipline. I don't know a single other person personally who reads them. Which is great, really. I feel sort of dirty when I read them, and I get a sort of transgressive thrill. So I hope to share that with you today. If you've ever been made to suffer through Foucault, I think you'll get a transgressive thrill out of these people as well. What I want to impress upon you is that for me, I'm not, or at least I didn't think I was, by nature a very transgressive or reactionary person. I passionately believe that a body of writing that systematically ignores the concept of human nature, despite the problematic uses to which that concept has in the past been put, a body of literature that ignores that concept will not be able to stand up to the body of writing which has had the most sophisticated understanding of human nature in history, which is of course literature and fiction. So let's dive into the controversy. I want to give you some conception of the sort of institutional position of literary Darwinism before we go ahead. Literary Darwinists have not minced words in sort of attacking the current paradigm or telling us what they think of it. So this is Joseph Carroll. He says, when he's evaluated post-structuralist theory and argued that it's inconsistent with basic scientific fact, he said, so, let me face squarely the historical and institutional implications of this rejection. If I'm basically right in my contentions, a very large proportion of the work in critical theory that has been done in the last 20 years will prove not merely to be obsolete, but essentially void. It cannot be regarded as an earlier phase of the developing discipline with all the honour due to antecedents and ancestors. It is essentially a wrong term, a dead end, a misconceived enterprise, a repository of delusions and wasted efforts. People in the humanities are not unintelligent. They have simply been trapped in local currents of intellectual history. At some point in the not too distant future, the sheer embarrassment of being unable to contribute in any useful way to the serious world of adult knowledge will, I think, have a decisive effect in reorienting the discipline. So this is fairly incendiary stuff. And there's a couple of others. This is Jonathan Gottschall, The Prognosis is Bad, the primary theoretical, methodological and attitudinal structs that support the field are suffering pervasive rot. If the discipline of literary study ultimately collapses, it will be because of the rot on these primary structs. And here's Brian Boyd arguing that if English is not put on a firmer theoretical footing, we will continue to be the laughingstock of the academic world. So I've picked Carroll, Gottschall and Boyd because they are arguably the sort of three foremost literary Darwinist writers. Here are some quotations from literary scholars who've hit back, and what I want to note about these quotations is that they're all taken from the introduction of the Oxford Handbook to Cognitive Literary Studies. So these quotations are from other literary scholars who work with cognitive science but are eager to distance themselves from these literary Darwinist people. So this is Ellen Spolsky. Darwinist failure to notice that conclusions drawn from the empirical data are never prima facie facts, but always the result of interpretation, as well as their relative lack of interest in the specific of individual literary texts, encourages me to distance myself from these literary scholars who've taken the Darwinian argument up precisely to separate themselves from the traditions behind the last 50 years of literary theory. Here is Lisa Sunshine describing cognitive literary science. She says, though we're vitally interested in cognitive science, we work not towards consilience with science, but towards a richer engagement with a variety of theoretical paradigms in literary and cultural studies. We differ from literary Darwinists, a small but vocal group of critics who practice scientism in the name of scientific literary analysis. And here's Nancy Easton. She says the very nature and diversity of literary artifacts, which are themselves only fully constituted via a complex cognitive process of production and consumption, a process itself inherently interpretive, militate against a programmatically scientific approach to literature. So there's a lot in here that I agree with. But what I think has happened is that people who have attacked literary Darwinism have systematically misunderstood what it is that people who advocate for a more coherent relationship between the sciences and the humanities are actually advocating for. When I gave a test version of this lecture in the graduate lecture series workshop, the teacher asked the audience to repeat back to me what it was that my short presentation had been about. And the first person from the audience who put up their hand assumed that because I had used the word cognitive, what I was going to talk about was the approach of using, for example, fMRI to scan people's brains to figure out the right way of reading literary texts. So let me make one thing perfectly clear at the start. The question of the right way to read a literary text is simply not a scientific question. It is not a question to which science can give us an answer. The fact that in the humanities investigate many questions that are not scientific, but that doesn't mean that science can't everywhere give us, useful pointers in the right direction or tools to be able to answer those questions. In these particular criticisms, everywhere we look, science has made the enemy of richness, of complexity, of critical thinking, of the spontaneous adjustment of one's methods to the subject at hand, and even of humanistic thought itself. So we get the idea that Darwinists are not really interested in humanistic scholarship, but actually what they want to do is simply to replace humanistic thought with science. I want to suggest that if there's a bias that caused the person in that audience to ask the brain scanning question, it's not a bias that comes from science, but a bias that is perhaps already in our classrooms when we do practical criticism. And it is this. It's something like that a literary text has something called a meaning, which is akin to a right answer, and that we could get at that right answer if only we had more information about the text. And that is as true of information about the author's life, about the political and historical circumstances that shaped the work, about the reception, that as true of all of those things as it is about the results of a brain scan from an fMRI. So it takes a little while to separate yourself from a particular way of looking at literature to see what it is that scientists might be interested in doing with it. The fundamental split between, I'm going to introduce the term consilience. So on the previous slide, Spolsky, so Sunshine introduced this term consilience, which is indeed the kind of fundamental split between literary Darwinists and other cognitive sciences. So to explain what consilience is, Edward Wilson, who's a biologist who, he's one of the world's kind of foremost contributors to biology in the last 50 years. He cut his teeth working with ants. He's a myrmecologist, but in the later part of his career, he turned his hand to expanding the sort of remit of what zoology could do. So he's most famous, notorious perhaps in the humanities, for having published Sociobiology in 1975, the text that argued that what we know about the way that evolution has shaped behaviour, social behaviour in other animals, can form the basis for a science of how evolution has also shaped social behaviour in human beings. This was dynamite, controversial stuff at the time, and it was attacked vigorously by many humanists, but sociobiology has kind of survived and given birth to evolutionary psychology since then. And the discipline has matured substantially in the way that I think many English scholars have not noticed, because they're still convinced that sociobiology and evolutionary psychology were debunked by real scientists in the 1990s, which they emphatically were not. So in 1998, Wilson published this book called Consilience. And consilience literally means the jumping together of different kinds of knowledge. Wilson argued that consilience was a relationship that already obtained between the different branches of the sciences. An example that John Tooby and Leda Cosmides, the founders of evolutionary psychology, give is that if you are a biologist, for example, you would not posit a life process occurring in a cell that contravened the laws of chemistry. You simply wouldn't do it. Or if you did, if you had reason to believe that the laws of chemistry are wrong, then you and the chemist would have a conversation. You'd work together to build a unified picture in which the laws that governed what you were studying were assumed to be consistent with each other. Tooby and Cosmides' complaint when they wrote the essays that began evolutionary psychology in 1992 was that that principle of mutual consistency and dialogue did not extend across the gap from biology to psychology. Because psychologists, as they saw it, were positing mental mechanisms that could not have evolved, that were inconsistent with Darwin's theory of evolution, which is the kind of unifying theory for all of biology. Wilson's more grand claim was that this relationship of consilience, of forming a unified picture and of fluid interdisciplinary boundaries, should extend all the way from the bottom of physics all the way to the far edges of the humanities. And the kind of most ambitious test of this would be the unification of the sciences and the humanities. So I'm going to give you, before I give you some idea of how that would work, I've put up a list of sort of scare words there that I hope I can explain over the course of the presentation today. So we've already had scientism. I'm also going to hopefully lead you through all of these others as well. But to say a brief word about scientism, scientism is a word which I think is often used vacuously to refer to the kind of overextension of science outside of the territory which it belongs. Obviously, I tend to disagree with people who use that word about what does constitute the overextension of science. Today I will not defend the claim that scientific questions are the only interesting ones we can ask, or the claim that all questions or all information is reducible into scientific or naturalistic form. Those claims I do believe are scientistic. Another useful definition of scientism that I want to put on the table is the ontologically insensitive application of techniques from the sciences in places where they're not the right techniques. So the idea that you can sort of solve everything with graphs or equations. But as we'll see, as I hope to demonstrate to you today, that kind of scientism has influenced the history of literary theory more substantially than you might appreciate. And that it is too late now to try and keep scientism out of literary theory by trying to keep the Darwinists out. All right. Okay. So one more thing I'm going to say while I'm on scientism to sort of clarify what I'm going to be arguing. So I've separated, obviously, the kind of scholarship that we do asks questions which are not naturalistic, which are not reducible to questions of truth or falsity or fact. But it's almost impossible to write anything in literary study without making factual claims, or without resting on a set of implicit factual claims about the world. Obviously, we study literature. Literature is made by human beings who use language in environing social realities. So most literary scholarship does depend on tacit assumptions about the nature of mind and its relationship to the world, of the makeup of the social world, and about social causation. The aim of Consilience is that when we draw on information about these things, we should be able to draw seamlessly on the most up-to-date knowledge from other disciplines that they have to offer us. And I've drawn two-way arrows. flattering myself that actually our discipline contributes back to those disciplines and helps to guide them as well. I want to give you an example of an instance of that failing to happen. When I was in my first year of PhD, I attended the Cambridge University graduate conference. And at that conference, a young man spoke who was in his fourth year of PhD. His PhD was about contemporary fiction and used schizophrenia as a metaphor for the divided psyches of Cold War era literature. I was taken aback because he talked for 15 minutes as though schizophrenia was a disease of split personalities, which of course it's not. So at the end of the presentation, I put up my hand and I said, are you aware that in your research you're perpetuating a stigmatizing myth about schizophrenia that has been debunked? I asked him whether he'd read any psychology textbooks on the subject. It turned out that in the course of 4 years of writing about schizophrenia, he'd not read a single psychology textbook. He had read a lot of books on madness and modernism and on psychoanalytic theory. It's not that he had not done his research. The problem was that he had inherited from his discipline a faulty idea of what it was to do one's research in this field. And the fact that he undoubtedly can get a thesis passed in an English department whose foundational conception of schizophrenia is incorrect seems like a problem to me. What we've got here is a case of the confusion between questions that are non-naturalistic questions, questions on which there are no right answers, only a series of productive perspectives which might be brought into dialogue with each other, and perspectives on which there clearly are right answers, and in which, for ethical reasons that matter to people's lives, getting the right answers matters. In this case, the young scholar had taken questions about schizophrenia for the first type of question, when I would argue that they actually need to be the second. Here is what I'm going to argue against. Here is what literary studies has done in the last 50 years. Instead of using up-to-date information from as many disciplines as we can, what humanists have done is curated their own personal body of ideas to draw on, such that if we want to find out about psychology, rather than going to a psychology textbook, we go to Freud or Lacan, for example. The problem with most of these ideas is that they belong to perspectives that have been defuncted in their own disciplines for an extended period of time. In the case of psychoanalysis, for upwards of 50 years now. So we look mainly at outdated versions of psychology, like psychoanalysis, outdated versions of sociological theory like Marxism. I should just clarify that when I talk about Marxism in that sense, I don't regard the normative goals of Marxism to be outdated, but Marx's scientific theory of social causation and how sciences work is no longer current in sociology. And outdated theories of how language works, which come fundamentally from the Saussurean and post-Saussurean tradition in structuralist linguistics, and those include everybody from people like Levi-Strauss all the way through to Derrida and Foucault, who are arguably still in this post-Saussurean vein. I am not arguing that everything Foucault says is wrong or useless. What I'm going to argue categorically against is the body of truth claims, or the kind of theoretical paradigm that comes from the history of 20th century science that underpins this form of theory. It is not humanistic scholarship, it is a body of truth claims about the world, human beings, the mind, language, social structures, and social causation. It occupies the same space as science. The contest here is not between scientific thought and humanities thought, it is between living science and dead science. My argument is that humanistic scholars cannot continue to try to build living theory from the dead bits of other disciplines' theory. Obviously, can I have a show of hands in the room? How many of you would say that your exposure to this kind of theory in your classrooms has been almost zero? How many would say you've had a moderate exposure to this kind of theory in your classrooms? How many would say you're embedded or you're immersed in it? Okay, so that's, okay, Joel is from the gender studies department. What was I about to say? I've lost my train of thought. So, obviously, the degree to which what I'm going to talk about is going to be relevant to you is going to depend upon this, the extent of the saturation of this kind of theory. And I was going to say, like the Frankenstein monster that it is, theory was officially pronounced dead in the 1990s, but it sort of continues to walk around and exert an influence. So this is the question that I want to sort of ask you today. So, Wilson's Consilience. Wilson's idea had two fundamental parts. The first was that the world, as it stands, forms a unitary order of causal forces hierarchically organised, running from physics upwards through chemistry, biology, sociology, etc. He argued, therefore, that disciplinary divisions within human knowledge were arbitrary, because the world is not divided up into disciplines, and that therefore people, when we do different forms of disciplinary research, we should be able to talk to each other. So when I talk about sort of breaking things down into constituent parts, let's start with the human body. The human body is a system of organs made up of relationships between cells. Cells are governed by chemical processes organised by DNA. The molecules that make up cells and replicate cells are governed by sort of fundamental chemical processes which themselves reduce to the laws of physics. The idea that biology, chemistry and physics form this sort of seamless hierarchy, we take for granted today that this was not always the case. Biology and physics, for example, were not always united. People used to think that that living organisms were animated by some sort of magical life stuff. And it was a significant breakthrough in the 1800s when scientists managed to show that what animated living cells was simply kind of ordinary chemical processes. Similarly, for Newton to propose a set of physical laws which he said governed the movement of all matter in the universe, the idea of universal laws was a step towards this kind of unifying framework. So, as we go from the bottom, we have event regularities that reduce to kind of universal regular processes, and then we build up in terms of levels of complexity from there. We also get structures that are more stable at the bottom and less stable at the top. So, to a certain extent, the kind of relative dynamism and complexity and evolution of living organisms depends upon the stability of the laws of chemistry. If the laws of chemistry were to randomly mutate, that would be the end of us as we know it, because we would no longer be able to sustain life. Wilson's point was that the way that scientists typically work is by taking a complex composite organism and trying to break it down into pieces to figure out how it works, going this way downwards, and that's what we would call consilience by reduction. You can go the other way, but it's much, much, much more difficult, right? If you were to start with the laws of physics, it would be extremely difficult to sort of get the laws of chemistry out of them predictably. Because I've used the word reduction, I'm just going to go to my second scare word, which is the idea of reductionism. When I talk about, this is fundamentally a diagram of levels of emergence. So, chemical processes are made up of the movements of matter. Biological organisms are made up of chemical processes. So each level of emergence is made out of the subsequent level. The idea that causal flow goes upwards is to say that things in the upper levels can't act causally downwards on the levels underneath them. Now, to explain what that means, I'm going to use the example of a house, for example, right? So a house is made up of bricks, mortar, everything that makes up a house. To say, we want to understand how, the structure of the house is something genuinely new and emerging from the composition of those elements. And yet at the same time, it's made up of nothing but those elements. The fact, however, that those elements have come together to form a novel structure will have causal effects on the way that those elements, respond. For example, if it rains, the topmost part of the house is going to get wet, but the inside will stay dry, right? So, despite the fact that that there's nothing in the house but what makes up the house, we've got a novel structure which can have a novel causal force. What we don't want is the idea that some kind of disembodied concept of the house can act causally upon its own components. Obviously, if the house is acting causally on its own components, then that's really just the components of the house acting causally on each other, but in an emergent structural way. In the prominent tradition of social constructionism in literary studies has been kind of split into a psychological dichotomy between deconstruction and what the Marxists would call reification, as in treating something as real, which is actually a construct made up of other things. This is fundamentally not the way that scientists think. Bruno Latour said that social constructionism was typically an attempt to reduce something to dust by showing that it had been made up. Evolutionists are also really interested in social construction But they argue that understanding how something is made up and constructed out of other elements does not reveal it as illusory in any sense. It's something emergent and real regardless. So there's no longer a sort of dichotomy between social construction on the one hand and reification on the other. So I've gone through reduction. I'm going to skip the lovely Steven Pinker quotation about how even if World War I consisted of nothing but a very, very large number of quarks and a very, very complicated pattern of motion, no insight is gained by describing it in that way, right? So understanding how these disciplines stack on top of one another does not remove the need for history or the humanities. So here's the rest of the picture. The same evolutionary processes that give rise to complex living organisms in the physical world give rise to neural patterns which produce systems of computation which give rise to minds. The minds of I'm going to focus, if we're looking at animals, for example, the level above this would be the ecosystem. Because we're looking at human beings, and because we're humanists, and because we're fundamentally interested in things like works of literature, and identities, and laws, and morality, and all of these things were up here. The level at the top in this diagram is going to be the level of social structures. Wilson originally conceived this diagram as a labyrinth. So he said, he used the example of Theseus and the Minotaur and said, obviously when Theseus went into the labyrinth to defeat the Minotaur, he took a ball of thread with him so that he could find his way out again. Wilson says that Consilience is the Ariadne's thread that we need to navigate this labyrinth. And in a similar vein to what he said about Consilience by reduction rather than synthesis, fundamentally what we usually do as scientists is go from somewhere into the center of the maze and find our way back out again. It's much more difficult to go the other way. Obviously, this maze is not like a regular maze in that it actually gets more and more complex and bigger as we go in towards the kind of infinite number of branching pathways that are the humanities and social reality. He justified Consilience in explicitly ethical terms. He said every college student should be able to answer this question: what's the relation between the sciences and the humanities, and how important is it for human welfare? Most of the issues that affect humanity daily, ethnic conflict, arms escalation, overpopulation, abortion, environment, endemic poverty, they can't be solved without integrating knowledge from the natural sciences with that of the social sciences and humanities. Only fluency across the boundaries will provide a clear view of the world as it really is, not as seen through the lens of ideologies, religious dogmas, or commanded by a myopic response to immediate need. I'm going to presume that when Wilson was talking about the problem of abortion, he was talking about the problem of debate and social contestation over the issue of abortion, but don't know. Right. So the next step in this diagram was the early success of the sciences came from their ability to take complex phenomena and do this reduction thing, to break them down into smaller elements and show how they were governed by more fundamental principles. Early forms of social science were usually modelled on this model. You took complex social structures and showed how they were governed by universal laws. That required you to do one of two things. Either it required you to posit that there were uniquely social laws that governed the functioning of social structures, and that was what, for example, sociologists like Emile Durkheim, one of the fathers of modern sociology, did. He famously said that the determining cause of a social fact should be sought not inside individual heads, but in the social facts that preceded it. So he said, for the purposes of sociology, we can ignore psychology, we can pretend that it doesn't exist. We can pretend that the principles that produce social life exist at the level of the social. That is an implicitly blank slate statement, a statement that implies that the human mind has no sort of innate structure or organisation that contributes to the makeup of the social world. We can do that, or we can take the approach of, for example, economics, which is to use a very simple model of human nature intentionally and be clear that that's what we're doing. So, hands up if you've heard the term Homo economicus. Yeah, a couple of people. So, the idea that the conception of human nature that undergirds the science of economics and was necessarily reduced to a very simple conception in order to make economics viable as a mathematical science is a conception of human beings as rational calculators who will do what enables them to obtain the maximum amount of happiness and kind of do what enables them to avoid the maximum amount of pleasure. It's basically kind of simple rational utilitarianism. But of course that ignores the fact that human beings are not rational calculators and that we're full of so many different motives, which is why so many economic theories fail to work. Right. So Tooby and Cosmides, the founders of evolutionary psychology in 1992, made the argument that the fact that this has to go on top of this has paradigm-shifting implications for the way that we think about social structures and the way that we do social science and humanistic scholarship. Why? Because the foundation for the social world is not a set of constant laws in the same way that the foundation for the natural world is. Instead, the foundation for the social world is an immeasurably complex network of evolved structures, both physical and cognitive. And I'm going to go through that with you now. So there's the full kind of picture of emergence in the scientific rationalist view. Darwin himself predicted evolutionary psychology when he wrote on the origin of species. He said that in the distant future, psychology would be based on a new foundation, that of the necessary acquirement of each mental power and capacity by gradation. So the job of evolutionary theory when it comes to psychology is the same as when it comes to any other branch of biology. Evolutionary biology is assigned with the task of showing how the complexity of living organisms has risen slowly and by step-by-step selection processes, rather than being intelligently designed all at once from the top down in increasing levels of complexity. The fundamental argument of evolutionary psychology is that evolutionary processes of selection have shaped the mind in the same way that they've shaped the body. Tooby and Cosmini said, your mind is designed by evolution to be a computer. Every organ in the body has a function. What is the function of the brain? Neural systems take inputs in the form of sensory data and they generate outputs in the form of behaviour. The kinds of systems that respond in that way, the kinds of computational systems we might put it that respond in that way according to kind of rules, will be selected on the basis of how successfully they keep you alive. And that goes all the way from the very first cell that was able to regulate its internal environment with a nucleus or move around its environment, all the way up to complex human beings who inhabit not only a physical world but a cultural world in which they have to negotiate for status in cultural environments. What have I got next? Okay, so I've got a quotation from Steven Pinker here because I think he explains this fairly well. He says the way that we used to think about human beings is as essentially this or as essentially that. If human beings have many different kinds of programs in their head which all do different things, then it fundamentally changes the way that we view human nature. He says, the mind is modular with many parts cooperating to generate a train of thought or an organised action. It has distinct information processing systems for filtering out distractions, learning skills, controlling the body, remembering facts, holding information temporarily, and storing and executing rules. Many of these modules, by the way, would have evolved before human beings separated from many last common ancestors ago. So many of these mental modules are ones that we would share with other organisms. The Darwinian view of consciousness is not as consciousness as something that human beings categorically have, separate from other animals, but as consciousness and intelligence and subjective experience as things that emerge by degrees as more and more computational modules build up and the mind gets more and more complex. Cutting across these data processing systems are mental faculties dedicated to different kinds of content. The upshot is that an urge or habit coming out of one module can be translated into behaviour in different ways or suppressed altogether by another module. So this is, I don't want to mislead you. Modules are not emotions, but this is a decent model of how a modular mind would work. You've got, you have a situation that you have to respond to, you have different modules which all want to respond to it differently, and some of the modules are pushing others out of the way to kind of generate the behaviour that ultimately comes out of the character in Inside Out. Jonathan Haidt has a very useful metaphor for talking about different kinds of reasoning that happen in the brain. Most early forms of cognitive systems that function in, simpler animals, not to be a human bigot, human chauvinist, think more automatically. This kind of slower conscious processing is unique to animals who are sort of closer to us in evolutionary time. So Haidt says this is a kind of split in the way that the mind works, for example. And he likens the split to a rider sitting on top of an elephant. The rider is the conscious reasoning part, and the elephant is all of these complex computational processes that do the intuitive processing that is required to navigate our lives. He picks an elephant for a couple of reasons. First, because elephants are smart, right? So most animals were able to get by with nothing but these intuitive and automatic processes. And he says that our elephants are still fairly smart and well adapted at navigating the environments that we live in. Most decisions we make do not require conscious reasoning. And even if we make conscious choices, the elephant makes suggestions. The elephant sort of automatically goes one way and we have to decide whether or not we want to accept that suggestion. The elephant typically acts automatically. It makes most decisions for itself. And the elephant is substantially bigger part of the team, right? The bigger, much older in evolutionary time part of the team. The writer, Haidt's theory of moral judgment, for example, is that we make most moral decisions intuitively, and then when we're asked why something is right or wrong, the writer confabulates and tries to come up with reasons, but actually the writer has no access to what the elephant is doing. The writer is, as Haidt puts it cheekily, the elephant's press secretary. But this conscious reasoning, is a big part of what makes humans distinct and can handle slower, more difficult decisions and more open cognitive processes. Importantly, the elephant would not have evolved unless it was of some use to the writer. So the relationship is not one of the writer existing to serve the elephant, but of the elephant. The relationship is not one of the elephant existing to serve the writer, but of the writer existing to serve the elephant. How am I going for time? I've talked for longer than I thought I was going to talk. Okay, so this is important. Previous conceptions of human nature, I've said, was essentialist. What this gives us for the first time is an anti-essentialist conception of human nature. And this takes me to my third scare word, which is essentialism. If you read Judith Butler, for example, Butler uses essentialism as a lazy synonym for any biological approach to the psychology of the mind or of gender. In fact, evolutionary science has been anti-essentialist at least since Darwin. We used to take an essentialist approach to species, for example, but Darwin replaced a model of species as static things in themselves with definite boundaries with a model whereby we understand that all species have evolved from each other, and that there are, if we take a snapshot of evolutionary time, it looks like we have distinct groups, and we can treat them as such for the purposes of taxonomy, but that, in terms of a larger time scale, is an arbitrary distinction. Or perhaps not entirely arbitrary. So, the central premise of the founding text of evolutionary psychology, Tooby and Cosmides have said, is that there is a universal human nature, but this universality exists primarily at the level of evolved psychological mechanisms, not of expressed cultural behaviours. If we understand the human mind as a collection of cognitive modules which have evolved to respond to environments differently, everybody can have the same fundamental set of cognitive modules which are coded for by the genes that wire up the brain, but they can respond to environments differently, they can take different cultural inputs and adapt to different cultural systems, and of course, because culture is a major part of human nature, some of the cognitive systems of the brain are left open for culture to finish off. And that's why the kind of traditional opposition between nature and culture is not the way that evolutionary psychologists typically think about it. We think about culture as an extension of human nature, something that evolved adaptively for us, and it's been one of our greatest successes. The final point that Tooby and Cosmides would make that I think is relevant here is that this shows us why cultural systems can't be understood to be turning over simply on their own logic. Saussure, for example, who's the linguist who underpins most of literary theory, understood language as a system of representations that are all mutually defining, and tried to locate the logic of the social world in the interaction between those representations. If we accept what Tooby and Cosmides are saying about the ways in which cognitive modules that facilitate the exchange of those representations are systematically biasing which representations are exchanged more often and more frequently because of the way that we've evolved, then the idea that the logic that governs how that system of representation works can be found within the system itself is a flawed theory. Saussure can look forever and ever inside language and never find the principles that fundamentally govern how that language works, because they're not inside the system, they're prior to it. And I think Tooby and Cosmides put this really well when they say that rejecting the design of individuals as central to the dynamics is fatal to these models because superorganic processes are not just out there external to the individual. Instead, human super-individual interactions depend intimately on the representations and other regulatory elements present in the head of every individual involved, and therefore on the systems of computation inside each head. These govern what is selected from out there, how this is represented, what procedures act on the representations, and what behaviours result others can then observe with and interact with. Cool. I'm going to, because I'm almost out of time, I'm going to kind of skip ahead to my, to talking about the standard social science model, because this is very important. Okay. So what Tooby and Cosmides argued was that the way that social science had been done up to that point, as though it was possible to reduce the social world to a set of fundamental laws or processes, necessarily assumed some things about the way that the human mind was made up. And the most fundamental of those things was that the human mind was a blank slate, that it had no innate structure or organisation, that it contributed nothing to the organisation or processes that make up social structures. Here is what we would call the standard social science model. We provisionally accept that evolution arises from scientific process, from kind of physical processes and has acted to produce living organisms' bodies, but then we flip these two levels over, such that we understand the social to come first, and we understand minds to emerge from the social. If you've ever read Butler, for example, or Foucault, and heard about people being referred to as discursive constructs, this is what it means. It is not merely the claim that language exerts a powerful shaping influence on human beings who already exist. Butler wants to challenge the idea that human beings are given ontological priority in the original scientific picture to the social. And she argues that that's not the case. The social exists first, and human beings are made out of social material, made out of language. I'm going to skip over the search for the others and stuff is really interesting, but I should not have put such an enormously long quotation on the slide, which is a good lesson for doing lecturing. So, briefly, the last thing I want to do is take you through some kind of versions of the standard social science model that have been really influential in literary theory. So, thinkers who have used models similar to this include, so I'll start with Karl Marx. Marx believed that, Marx famously pronounced that man is determined by his, or man is a product of his, what's the quotation? I've got it somewhere. Man is not some abstract being squatting outside the world. Man is the totality of social relations. Marx was strongly influenced by a German philosopher called Hegel, who believed that the world we live in was determined by a logical or a dialectical process that somehow kind of created the reality that we lived in. Hegel was an idealist who believed that the kind of real world, we didn't really have access to reality. Marx was not. Marx was a materialist. So Marx accepts, something like this picture up to this point. But he thought that Hegel's principle of the dialectic obtained for the social world. And so he built a theory which he called dialectical materialism, which argued that fundamental economic relations were the basis for this social structure. The economic relations gave rise to particular kinds of social relations, and the entirety of society grows on top of that. And out of that comes individual minds and individual consciousness. When you're working with a politics like that, rather than understanding human beings having evolved with minds that are adapted to the environment in which they live, you're working with a model where minds emerge only ever from the social material out of which they're made. And that makes it very difficult in the Marxist estimation for people to think outside of the social material that they come from. So often literary theories influenced by Marxism emphasize how the cultural logics of literary texts are in some sense compulsory, and it's very difficult for us to kind of think outside of ideology. Of course, if you accept the other version of the picture, then you would, you can still talk about ideology, but it's much harder to make the case that ideology is either all-encompassing or compulsory or somehow completely reprograms the brain. So another version is the Saussurean principle of language as a fundamental system of signs, which I've already gone through a little bit. What's interesting to note that in the transition from structuralism, and Levi-Strauss is a good example actually. So Levi-Strauss, as a structuralist sociologist, tried to find the fundamental principles from which all human social life emerged, and he thought that principle was, the principle of exogamy, of not being able to, of binary relation and not being able to kind of merge with the same, I guess, and having to leave the community. When we transition from structuralism to post-structuralism, we abandon the idea that we can analyse this system scientifically and that we can divine its fundamental laws. We understand the systems as kind of more plural and as not necessarily operating according to a unified logic, but we keep the fundamental view of human minds as emergent from cultural systems, even if we've changed the way that we think about cultural systems slightly. So what's ironic is that most of the theory that's influenced literary study, including Foucault and Butler in this estimation, have retained a view of thinking about social structures that ultimately comes from an outdated form of scientism, I would argue. So we end up here. We've got a sort of impasse between two ways of looking at the social world. Those who prefer the standard social science model, or versions of it, tend to, we're in a sort of catch-22 because these thinkers attack evolutionists quite convincingly. They say, the theories of human nature that you've come up with are already predetermined by the social logics of domination and subordination that kind of fundamentally govern the production of all knowledge. That, I hope I've managed to show you how that perspective kind of begs the question. Because if you believe that the view of social as primary and mind as emergent from it is wrong, and you believe rather that humans are complex organisms, not only do you believe that social structures can't be reduced to a single logic or a set of fundamental laws, and that includes not being able to reduce the social world to a single logic of power and domination and subordination, but also that human beings are not so infinitely reprogrammable as to have their access to the external world completely cut off by an ideology which already determines in advance what scientific knowledge can discover. Sunshine argued that we needed to keep, I'm going to skip over this because I've run out of time. Sunshine argued that we needed to keep the scientism out of literary studies by keeping the Darwinists out. My point today has been to try to argue that it is too late for that, by about 100 years. Carroll's call for consilience with the sciences and putting literary theory on a more solid foundation comes fundamentally from a place of not wanting to replace it with kind of cold reductionism, but wanting to humanistically enrich it. He writes, literary study has to have substance. It has to deal with human realities, with psychological impulses and social forces. Derridian wordplay offered too thin an atmosphere in which to breathe. He quotes Hamlet saying that art is meant to hold the mirror up to nature, and expresses his frustration saying that if Derrida is right, that would be impossible because nature would have the structure only ever of mirrors reflecting other mirrors, if you've ever studied Derrida's concept of difference and iterability. The idea that bringing science into the humanities somehow cheapens or reduces them is a very old one, and I think those of you who are going through the history of English literature will be able to detect a kind of flare of old romanticism in it. This is from Keats. Do not all charms fly at the mere touch of cold philosophy? There was an awful rainbow once in heaven. We know her woof, her texture, she is given in the dull catalogue of common things. Philosophy will clip an angel's wings, conquer all mysteries by rule and line, empty the haunted air, gnomon mine, unweave a rainbow, as it erstwhile made the tender person Lamia melt into a shade. Obviously, Darwin weathered a fair bit of criticism in his time for the idea that showing how human beings had evolved from apes somehow cheapened them or robbed them of a certain sort of human dignity. But he emphatically didn't see it that way. Towards the end of Origin of the Species, he wrote, I've got the quotation here, "When I view all beings not as special creations, but as the lineal descendants of some few beings which lived long before the first bed of the Silurian system was deposited, they seem to me to become ennobled." So I'm going to finish with this cliche but I think still very beautiful passage, which is the final passage upon the origin of species. There is grandeur in this view of life with its several powers, having been originally breathed into a few forms or into one, and that whilst this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms most beautiful and most wonderful have been and are being evolved. Thank you. I haven't left much time for questions, but I think the main thing that I have learned from that is that I tend to chronically overestimate the amount of material I'll be able to get into a 1 hour lecture. So thank you very much for being my guinea pigs, and I hope that it's been stimulating, and if you want to ask questions, I can take a couple now, like the 5 minutes that we've got. Yep.
Yes, so thank you very much. That was very interesting. And I especially value the way that you emphasize the importance of the external world for literary studies. I think that's very valuable, especially at this moment. I have a couple of challenges.
Okay.
Well, which I think are challenges, they might very well not be. But I guess if there are people, undergraduates who wants to ask a question first, they should.
Do you want to like give me one challenge, and then if anybody else wants to ask a question, they can, and you can come
Okay,
and
so,
afterwards?
okay, so what I'll start with is, just because you said it last, is that evolutionary science has been anti-essentialist since Darwin. I don't think that is essentially true. I think that Darwin is very not anti-essentialist in the very specific matter of species. In that way, he is anti-essentialist. He is essentialist in lots of other things.
Yeah.
For example, because you had the example of Butler, he's very essentialist in gender, especially in On the Descent of Man. For example, Lloyd Morgan, another Darwinian, actually an evolutionary psychologist from the end of the 19th century, he uses the words lower and higher species in a very, very consistent way. Now, what I would like to argue is that they do this because of the social and cultural context they're in, which is, it seemed to me, exactly what you were arguing against, because according to your structure, what happens first is the mind, and then only the social and cultural context comes next. And what seems to happen with the here essentialist evolutionary scientists is that their own practice sort of contradicts the statement that you made. So I'm curious what your reaction to that would be.
Sure. So I have a couple of things to say to that, and it's a really good question. I'm glad you asked it. So I am aware of Darwin's backwards views on women and on racism, and I agree 100% that those were influenced by the cultural context in which he wrote. So a couple of things that I want to emphasise. First is with this picture. I'll go back to the picture that I'm advocating for, the scientific rationalist picture on the left. We can still have theories of ideology, and we can still have theories of how social structures shape knowledge of its context. What we need to do is not understand social structures as operating according to fundamental laws which precede the mind, which is the way that most literary theorists have understood them. Of course, saying that we don't want downward causation, it doesn't mean that social structure doesn't influence the human mind. It just means that the emergence effects of human minds creating human culture, there's a kind of reciprocal influence that happens here. The point that I would make is, I certainly believe Darwin was sexist. What I wanted to register my disagreement with was Judith Butler, for example, using essentialism as the word that is a synonym for sexism. Because I think that Darwin's sexualism was Darwin's sexism would have been an anti-essentialist sexism. And it's perfectly possible to believe that men and women differ on average on population level characteristics, which is what most sexist evolutionary psychologists believe. Not that most evolutionary psychologists are sexist, but there's certainly some who are, right? And that is not essentialism. Human gender is not binary, but it is strongly bimodal. And the developmental processes that shape it tend to produce average differences between men and women. So, evolutionary psychology is concerned with those things, and it's sort of the attempt to investigate those things empirically typically gets them into trouble. What I would emphasise is I think that research is, though controversial, is still important, and I reject a view which says that the outcomes of that research are forever and ever determined by evolutionary psychology's sort of inauspicious beginnings. Alan Sokal and John Rickmont have a good quotation where they say, "The roots of the tree of science are bitter, but its fruits are sweet." Yeah?
This is just a really, really general question, but I'd love to just hear a bit more about what this particular approach sort of actually tells us about individual literary texts. So I'm thinking of Boyle, for instance. He offers a really interesting close reading of Arda in his book, Story of Nabokov, kind of enlightened this theory. But what else does it have to offer as a method of thinking about books?
So I think the process of building a paradigm for literary studies on this foundation is still absolutely in its infancy. And one of the things which I sort of wanted to talk about but ran out of time was I'm not really impressed with efforts so far to read individual literary texts through the lens of literary Darwinism. And those readings do exist. There are, for example, Carroll's readings of Pride and Prejudice in terms of sex-differentiated mating strategies, or Gottschall's readings of the Iliad in terms of violence and power. And let me be clear, I don't think the evolutionary psychology of sex differences and violence are inherently laughable, but, the literary reading is a little bit. I think, if those kinds of readings are ridiculous, then I think they're ridiculous because they fall in a general pattern of trying to read with theory in a way that, to me, fundamentally misunderstands what reading is. And that goes just as much for feminist readings, Marxist readings, you know, taking any body of theory, plonking it on top of literary text and trying to use it to interpret. For me, the argument that I'm going to present in April to the British Society for Literature and Science, using the philosophy of Wittgenstein, is that this critique of the standard social science model enables us to clear away a false picture of what reading might have meant, a scientific picture of what reading might have meant that comes from this old tradition of scientism. And so I'm going to be advocating using ordinary language philosophy as a kind of a tool for reading instead. So if you want to come to London in April and listen to me do that, then yes. But I think, you know, people who, a criticism that often gets levelled at literary Darwinism is the idea that it hasn't generated enough in terms of positive theories, and that it's mostly focused on getting rid of post-structuralism. As a person working on LGBT text who has been wrestling with post-structuralism for 3 years, I think it's possible to understate the importance of getting rid of post-structuralism just as valuable work in and of itself. And my hope is that clearing away a sort of false picture will enable a flourishing of productive new contributions to literary studies. I'm not going to keep you past 2 o'clock, but if you want to come and talk to me afterwards. I also have handouts on the table if you want to read any more about what I've talked about. You can come and grab a reading list. Thank you so much, guys.